Hi, and welcome to our podcast called Define and Conquer, which we're doing in collaboration with the European Health Psychology Society and, in particular, one of its special interest groups in conceptualization, formalization, and measurement. And this podcast is hosted by myself, Olga Persky, and I'm at Stockholm University in Sweden, and Christoph Bamberg, who is at the University of Salzburg in Austria. And this is our first episode with a guest, and we're very excited that today we're welcoming Annick De Paepe from the University of Ghent. Annick is going to talk to us about clearer construct definitions. So in this episode, we're really going to dig into how we can think about the constructs that we're using in our research and create better definitions. So Annick, we are super excited to have you here with us. And would you mind starting off by telling us a bit about your background?
Yes, thank you. Excited to be here. So I'm trained as an experimental psychologist. So I think that explains part of my interest in the methodological aspects of research. During my PhD, I also did a master in data analysis, which further fostered that interest. And I have to say that in the beginning, I was very skeptical about self-report instruments, using mostly experiments and neurophysiological measures. And so I was really more into cognitive neuroscience, which I thought was more objective at that time. However, I think along the way, I realized that in neurophysiological measures, you also have to make a lot of decisions, making it less and less objective. And actually, maybe it's not about objective, subjective, but it's just tagging into two very different aspects, where self-report measures can tag into beliefs or experiences of people, whereas neurophysiological measures can reflect cognitive processes, but they can never really reflect beliefs or experiences. So we need self-report measures, I realized. But I also realized that a lot of our self-report measures, unfortunately, are not that good for the moment. And so I'm really, I think, very keen on thinking about how we can do it better. And I think at that point, I realized that everything starts with good definitions. And that's basically where my interest came from.
That sounds like a nice topic. And also welcome from me. Thank you for coming on the show. And interesting that you did a master besides the PhD in data science, is that? That's
Yes.
cool.
Yeah. Well, a lot of the courses were in the evening, so it was
okay. Wow.
in that way.
That sounds quite challenging.
Combined, but it was challenging because of a lot of group work.
And just spontaneously, what would you say was something specific from data science that you took away also for the PhD and psychology work?
I think what I actually liked most about it was that there were people from all kinds of backgrounds following that master, and how these different backgrounds made you look at things completely differently, and how that can really, how do you say that? How that can really broaden your scope on things, and give you a completely different perspective on things.
Mm-hmm.
Like on self-report measures, for example. We had interesting discussions on that there as well.
Yeah, so
I mean, can I just follow up on, I thought it was very interesting also what you said about that you first were very skeptical about self-report measures. Do you want to expand a bit on why you were so skeptical?
Yeah, I think being an experimental psychologist, it's all about experiments, and that's the only way also to infer causality, which is also one of the topics that I'm currently still interested in. And I always felt like if I completed self-report instruments myself, that I took it very seriously in the beginning. But then if I moved on to question 3, 4, 5, maybe 50 in some cases, I realized that I was just using some heuristics, like, I answered 3 to the previous question that was kind of related, so now I'll answer 3 again. And so that for me was a reason to question it. And I think, I'm still realize that these problems are there for self-report measures. If we make them too long, people get tired. So these problems are there. But I do think if we develop them well and work together with the people that actually have to fill them out, that we can make self-report instruments that make sense and that are useful.
Yeah, that already sounds quite interesting. Maybe, since this is the first episode, and in the teaser we kind of mostly talked about problems, maybe you could take us a step back and just specify the main problem that you want to talk about today and that you're researching here.
Yeah, so I think if you take a look at a lot of the papers, a lot of the manuscripts that are out there, you'll find often no definition at all of the constructs that are discussed. And if definitions are provided, a lot of the times they are very short and not very informative, having a really broad definition that doesn't really cover what the authors are actually talking about. And I think that has various problems. One of them is that, of course, if we don't have a common language, for example, you talk about attitude and I talk about attitude, we could be talking about totally different things. Or in the same way, if we use different terms, for example, you say outcome expectancies and I say attitude, but actually we are referring to the same thing. And that's something that is called the Jingle Jangle fallacy. It's when the same label is used, but different definitions. So that's the Jingle fallacy, or Jangle fallacy is then when you use different labels, but the definition is the same. And so I think that poses problems because we think we are talking about the same thing, as I said before, but actually we're talking about different things.
Yeah.
And so that's a first problem.
And would you say this is specific to health psychology, or is this just a general problem in science?
I think it's a general problem. I think it exists in many different branches. I think it's maybe somewhat more common in social sciences than it may be in the more exact sciences, because we are dealing with social kinds or practical kinds and not natural kinds. So they don't exist out there in the world, most of the constructs that we are working with. So that's why I think it's a problem that occurs somewhat more often, maybe in the social sciences.
Mm-hmm. So,
do you want to give some examples of the differences between the social and natural sciences in this regard?
So natural kinds are really things that are out there. As I said, for example, gold, it's an element, it's determined by its atomic structure. And practical kinds, these are categories that are created by humans for functional purposes. So we create them to organize or to predict or control our environment. So they serve a practical utility, but they don't necessarily reflect those deep natural boundaries. For example, we have our diagnosis of mental disorders. We categorize someone as having a major depressive disorder. But that's not a real thing that exists in the natural world. We decide where we put those boundaries. And then you have social kinds. Those are categories that exist through social agreements, practices, institutions, and they become real through our collective recognition, let's say, the practices that we use, the behavioral patterns that we have. That's, for example, marriage. It could be an example, or money.
Yeah. So this is very interesting because I suppose there are also maybe slightly different takes on this, even in the social sciences and psychology, that maybe some scientists still feel that there may be, that the constructs that we're working on are sort of more like natural kinds, or it's been described in the literature that there is maybe sometimes some implicit realism in the work that we do. But then, I suppose it's still maybe not often the case that when we speak to other psychologists or when we go to conferences or we speak to practitioners, that people really think that most of the constructs that we're working on, like self-efficacy and motivation, that they sort of exist as natural kinds.
Implicit realism, could you explain it a little bit more?
Yeah, sure. So realism is really quite closely tied to the idea about natural kinds, and that the phenomena that we are studying, that they really exist in and of themselves, independent of any sort of human interpretation or boundary conditions.
Yeah, and then you have the opposite, which is like the constructivist perspective, right? Which is that the humans made all the categories and they created for particular purposes within specific social and scientific contexts, which is the other extreme. And I think there are some senses like in between that you have the pragmatism realism account that says like pragmatism is that believes and theory are linked to our practical engagement with the world rather than to the world as it actually is. And so then the pragmatism realism says that it considers a commitment in the world. So our concepts are not intentionality independent, but it does not hold that the concepts used do not relate to the reality at all. So it's something in between, I think.
Okay.
I quite like this stance myself.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, are you committed to a specific philosophical school when it comes to this?
Are you asking me, Christoph?
Is that a question?
Both of
Yeah.
you.
Well, I think for me, I think I would for the moment say that I like that pragmatism realism account. I don't think that it's completely not something that exists in reality, but still we have to acknowledge it's not like the gold that is there. So I like the in-between position on that.
Yeah, and I agree, because I also think that as health psychologists, I think we still see quite clearly in the world that people behave very differently and that it is very closely connected to people's values and beliefs and lots of these constructs that we study. So I think also as a person living in the world, maybe not always like a scientist, I think, we really see these phenomena in the world. So making some connection between these sort of epistemological stances and our lived reality, I think, for me at least, it puts me somewhere on that spectrum. And I think, pragmatic realism is somewhere in between.
Okay. Yeah, so now we talked about before how clear constructs are defined and Jangle, so some constructs are less clearly defined and others are encompassing more things to be observed. And now we talked about this epistemological stance. And I was just wondering how those two things are related. So is it depending on the kind of philosophical perspective I have, I define my constructs differently? Or, what is the relation between construct definition and the epistemological stance? So epistemology, that is how I perceive the world, right? Like the science of how things are experienced. I guess we can summarize it like this.
Or, well, I would maybe say that epistemology is how we come to learn about things in the world.
Yeah, that's probably better. Yeah. All right. So how would you say those topics are related?
Yeah, Annick, maybe you want to.
Yeah, I think your stance on this will influence how you would construct your definitions, I think. And I think like if you think that it's something that is really out there, then you would probably try to look at, okay, what is maybe the parts of it that make it what it is. And well, I give a sneak peek at what we did, but I think we took, or at least we tried to take, a kind of the best of both worlds approach there as well, where we did try to look at what is the parts that are essential for it, but at the same time acknowledging that will not be possible for everything, and that there may be, for some of the constructs, there may be a necessity to leave that and to think about, okay, what are the elements that are very important for it to be what it is, but at the same time be open for the possibility that there are other aspects as well.
Also, Annick, am I right in assuming as well, so coming back, Christoph, to your question about how epistemologies relate to the jingle jangle fallacy and measurements, that maybe also if one adopts a stance that kind of is more constructivist, but then maybe towards the more pragmatic dimension, that actually it's not problematic that people might have different definitions, right?
Yeah, exactly. I think that's also one aspect. If you take a more pragmatic stance, then you would say that your definition will depend on the specific context in which you use your construct. And then it's not really a problem that different definitions exist next to each other, because it just depends on the context in which you use it. And you should just be transparent about in which context are you right now and why are you using then the definition that you're using and which definition are you using. And so, I think that's one of the solutions that is proposed to this problem that we have. is like, okay, we will not be able to come up with a universally agreed upon definition. I think I follow that, being a kind of more a pragmatist in this. So, but maybe it's not necessary. I mean, maybe it's not the heterogeneity that is dangerous, but it's the hidden heterogeneity, the fact that we are not open about it. As I said, often people don't even share their definitions. So that is a problem. And so if we would just create definitions and we put them in our manuscripts alongside our constructs, then people can see, oh, this is what you mean with that. Well, I see that differently. And then you can argue, you can start a discussion about that, or you can use different definitions in your own papers and explain why you do that. Maybe because it's a different context, you are working maybe with a different population, you have a different theory in mind. So that's all possible, I think. And so one of the solutions is proposed by Erik Krutsen and Gjalt-Jørgen Peters, who proposed the Decentralized Construct Taxonomy, the DCT in short. And that's basically a kind of a repository where you can put your constructs, so your construct's label, the name of your construct, the date that we produced it, the version of it, because it will always be something that is still under development. It's an iterative procedure. And then you put your definition alongside that. And you can even put like instructions on how you can best measure the construct, and also different aspects, for example, how you can elicit the construct's content and so on. And so then each of these constructs gets a unique identifier, and you can use that in your manuscript to refer to your DCT. And I think that's a very nice solution to that problem.
Yeah, that sounds quite interesting. Could you maybe give an example? So if I want to use the term self-regulation, maybe, or choose an example that you prefer, then there might be different versions of the self-regulation concepts, and then I just link to this specific one, and then there's a more detailed explanation of that on the website.
So you could have several DCTs of self-regulation, and it has all of them would have a unique identifier. And so then it's immediately clear which definition of self-regulation that you are referring to.
Okay, yeah. I feel like intuitively or naively, maybe we would think, well, but shouldn't it just be one definition of a term, right? But
yeah, and I think that's maybe, I mean, a difficulty. And I think we have been discussing about that as well, that at least, for example, within a research group, we should be able to agree on that, right? Because we all have kind of the same background, and we are working towards the same goals and towards the same or similar research questions. But I think if you are working in different contexts and having different populations and so on, then it makes sense that you can have those differences. And sometimes, I mean, people just don't agree. I think we often have that in science, and that's actually fostered progression in science. I think if we would all always agree, then we would just stand still. There would be no evolution anymore. So I think it's not always a bad thing to have these discussions.
And also, if I understand correctly, the point of adding a new DCT to the repository, isn't it also when one group or one person's definition sort of substantially differs from somebody else's? But then I suppose it also becomes a question of what makes a definition substantially different from another one, and maybe also leads us into kind of the length of a definition or what it should include. Because Annick, you also alluded to that often in papers, and I'm also guilty of this myself, that we might just mention the constructs and then directly refer to the measurement that we're going to use to capture it. So it's all very implicit what we mean by it. So when we think about the length of these definitions, could you maybe give an example of what would be a too short definition?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. I think one of the constructs that I'm immediately thinking about is attitude, for example, which is sometimes defined just as a positive or a negative, let's say, feeling or about a specific kind of vague. That could be more specific, but let's say it's just in general often defined as a positive or a negative feeling that you have towards something. And that's very broad, that's very vague, right? And then, as I alluded to before, attitude is something that is present in a lot of behavior change theories. And I think I teach on behavior change theories, and students are always very confused. Yeah, but you know, you have attitude in those different theories, but sometimes they mean something different. And how is that? So I think there, if you have that more specific definition, that would be more clear for students also. Like, but in that theory, they are alluding to that specifically. And in that theory, they're alluding to that. And that's why it's different. So, for example, if I think in some of the models, outcome expectancies is used, that's very related to attitude, right? And some of the other models, outcome expectancies would be a part of attitude. And so it's these kind of things that would be very interesting to know, like, okay, how is that related to one another? And how do the different models see that? Do they indeed see outcome expectancies as a part of it, or how are they different? And so it's these aspects. And that's also something that actually in the DCT you can also add is like related constructs. What is related and how are they different from each other? And so I think that's, especially when thinking about defining a construct, that's also something that is, for me at least, very helpful, is thinking about, okay, this is the construct that I have, and these are related constructs, and those are the specific aspects on what they differ from each other.
Yeah, I was wondering about this because before we just kept our actual construct definitions implicit. Now we have this plurality of different definitions. Is there also some kind of reintegration happening? So you said that there's some relatedness on the same level then, I guess. But is there some way to, I don't know, kind of distill it back into one construct, or would that just be a step back into a very vague definition then?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think, again, the question is like, why are these different definitions existing? Is it because it's really necessary, because they refer to fundamentally different processes, because they are used in different contexts and so on? Or is it indeed, is there some overlap, and could we like discuss with each other and maybe come to some kind of an agreement? I think in some cases that may be useful. And I mean, ideally, indeed, we would go to maybe some kind of an ontology of concepts that most of us at least can agree on. That would be very convenient. I'm in favor of those kind of efforts as well. It's not that I say like, oh, don't try to reach consensus. But I think in some cases we have to be realistic. If you try to do that, you will always remain very general, I think. And in some cases, you need something more specific. So it's also about what's the purpose of your construct. And maybe in some cases, keeping it general will be sufficient. But I think in a lot of cases, for very specific studies, you'll need a more specific definition.
Right.
Annick, this also takes us to one of your projects that you have been working on, because I know you've been thinking a lot about how we can go about creating longer definitions, maybe not just longer, but more elaborated definitions that can then also help other scientists to understand, is this definition going to be useful in the context I'm working on versus not? So do you want to talk us through this effort in a little bit more detail?
Yeah, so indeed, we encountered the DCT, and so we were a fan of that. And so we wanted to make some definitions of our own. But then actually, it's not that easy to come up with a definition, a more specific definition instead of a general one. And so we started thinking about that. And I think we looked a little bit at first to, well, what is out there. And at first we only found some existing criteria for more formal requirements, like avoid ambiguity in your definition or avoid circular reasoning, which are, I think, the more obvious ones. But we didn't really find a clear step-by-step process at first. So we thought a little bit more about that. And then we found some guidance by McKenzie and Potsakov, who do provide a kind of an iterative procedure, a 4-step procedure to construct definitions. And we tried that out on concepts of the health action process approach, which is one of those behavior change models. And so it has a pre-motivational phase and a post-motivational phase. So basically describing how people form their intention, but then also how they go from their intention to their action, to behavior. And so we focused on that second part. So how they go from intention to behavior, focusing on action planning, coping planning, self-efficacy, and action control. So we tried to define those 4 constructs and having really clear definitions. And so maybe...
So Annick, was there a specific reason why you chose to focus on the health action process approach and the constructs within that theory?
Yeah, I think it's just a model that we are using within our research group. We often use it we develop digital interventions for physical activity. And so a lot of us are using the health action process approach to do that. We also use it within our teaching activities. So I think most people of our group were familiar with that. And so that's one of the things, as I said, we discussed that at least within our group and for the concepts that we are generally using, we should try to agree on them and use them in a consistent way. So that's why we decided to start with some of the concepts that we all regularly use, either for teaching or for research.
Yeah, and it's interesting as well that you said that when you started looking to different methods for going about creating clearer construct definitions, it sounded like there wasn't that much out there written about it.
No, actually not. And I think those articles of Mackenzie and Potsakov are already somewhat older. So there is no really recent literature, at least as far as we could tell, that described that. And so that's interesting because I think a lot of people are at least also trying to, for example, or more in the ontology, that it's also very important to have good definitions. And so, yeah, I think there were no clear guidelines as to how they created their definitions. And of course, you will see, I mean, I can take you to the process, and it's a kind of elaborate process. And I can imagine that you cannot always do that. And that's for every construct. So it's, yeah, we can talk about that later, but it's maybe taking some kind of middle way may be useful at some point. But it was useful, I think, to first go through that elaborate process to also find out what are the key aspects of that process that we cannot skip maybe, or that are very important to think about. And as I already gave a kind of a teaser, like for me, looking at what are the related constructs and how it can be differentiated from that is one of those things that I found like, oh, that's actually very helpful.
Yeah, I was wondering about that. So you said that there were 4 specific constructs that you tried to find a better or more precise definition for. In doing so, you already thought about their relatedness as well? Or was it a second?
So, of course, they were all from the same model, so from the health action process approach. So in that sense, the theory already provided some guidance as to how they might be related to each other, which is actually also in the first instance why we chose to take those concepts. So concepts that were all from the same theory, because we thought, oh, that will make it easier, because then at least we have something to start with. It turned out that that was helpful, I think, for some of the concepts, not for the other ones. And I think, yeah, maybe Olga, you can come in at that point, because I think it was especially maybe for self-efficacy and action control that was less useful, and that we had to go broader to other theories as well. For action planning, coping planning, I think those 2 constructs are mostly used only within the theory, and there is quite some things to be found within the more seminal papers on the HAPA for those 2 constructs. So that was helpful there. And so that's actually...
Annick, so what were the steps that you kind of came up with using this guidance from the papers that you found?
Yeah, so the first step is to examine how the construct has been used in prior research. And so we went to look for a representative set of definitions that were used for the construct in prior studies. And we, of course, we did not do a systematic review for all of the constructs, but we focused on the seminal papers, on review papers. So we kind of did a kind of a targeted review for that. We also looked at theories in which the construct was used. So, of course, that was HAPA in most of the cases. But as I said, for some of the constructs, we had to go a little bit broader. And we also looked at ontologies and the definitions that were provided there, taxonomies, dictionaries even. And so we took the most common definitions there. And then from that...
Sorry to interrupt, because it's the third time that you use the term ontology now, and I still struggle a little bit with it, to be honest. And maybe also our listeners are not so familiar with it. So maybe you could just briefly say what it is, because I think it will also come up more regularly in the podcast, most likely. So yeah, sorry.
I can give it a start, and then you can fill in the gaps when I'm finished. I think it's a kind of a way to represent knowledge. So I think the most basic kind of ontology is a taxonomy, and I think that will be more familiar to people because that's the way in which we organize, for example, the animals. You know, you have animals on top, and then you have the different kind of animals. You have the mammals and the reptiles and so it's a way of structuring the knowledge that you have, having the kind of the how do you call it, the ancestors and then the children of those concepts and their needs. And so in an ontology, as I said, it's common to have for each of the nodes that you have, each of the entities, that you have good definitions alongside with that. Yeah, I don't know if you want to add on that.
That sounded like an excellent definition. And we will also on the podcast have at least one or maybe two episodes specifically on ontology. So we will dig into it more then as well. Yeah. Also, maybe just one thing to add is that I also think it's common with formal ontologies that it's also in computer language. Such that it can also be interoperable with other knowledge representations.
Yeah, indeed. I think that's one of the advantages and why people use them, right? Because they are computer readable and then usable, for example, in interventions.
Okay, yeah, I feel like now I maybe start to understand this term a little bit better. So so step one was kind of reviewing the use of the terms. And then step two was looking at ontologies, other taxonomies for how they're used there, right?
Yeah, that's actually still within step one. So within step one, we just looked at all kinds of definitions. So that could be within those papers, that could be within ontologies, that could be so just gathering as much definitions as possible or descriptions. I mean, it's not about formal definitions at that point, just any descriptions about the concepts that we could find. And then in the second step, we tried to organize these definitions a little bit, the different aspects that are within the definition. And so we called these attributes. So we tried to extract the different attributes that were within these definitions, so kind of pieces of the definitions that came back several times. Although if, for example, we thought that there was a very important element, even if it was only mentioned once, we kept it. So it's not about the frequency, but really about the importance that we thought as a group. And we also asked feedback on that at several stages. About the aspects that were important. So we identified and organized these kind of core attributes and categorized them as either necessary for defining the construct or being more kind of additional information that could be useful maybe in some instances to distinguish it from closely related constructs, for example. And so that gave us with a set of necessary and sufficient conditions. For example, for coping planning, we had it's prospective, it's self-regulatory, it's a self-regulatory strategy, and it's directed towards reaching a specific goal or action. And it's about the identification of barriers and the identification of strategies to cope with those barriers. So these were the kind of attributes that we had specifically for coping planning. And then based on that, we developed a working definition. So a kind of a very first version of a definition. So we started in that definition by specifying the nature of the phenomenon. So is it a thought? Is it a feeling? So again, if we take coping planning, then it's kind of a cognitive process and more specifically that prospective self-regulatory strategy. And then also thinking about, okay, to whom does it apply? Is it to an individual or is it to a process or an organization? So here it was an individual. And so then based on this, We also added then in the working definition those necessary and sufficient attributes that we identified in the previous stage. And also in that working definition already stated like, okay, it's related, for example, to action planning, but the difference is, and then specifying how it's different. So for coping planning and action planning, that's the fact that coping planning is about thinking about these barriers and strategies on how to overcome barriers, while action planning is not about these barriers yet. It's just about making a specific plan about what you're going to do. So it's also prospective, it's also self-regulatory, but it lacks that aspect of the barriers and the strategies to overcome the barrier. And then there was a whole process after that about refining that definition, because of course that's a very rough version. And for each of the concepts, we were two. So we were two researchers thinking about the concept. So we already had a discussion, of course, amongst the two of us. But then we also went to the wider group. So we were in total a group of 8 people who thought about this. And then we went to the broader research group. And also we contacted people via email. So for example, Schwarzer, who is one of the founders of the health action process approach. So he invented the model, but also to other people, researchers who regularly use HAPA, for example, or people who also think about good definitions and more formal definitions, how we can create them. So we contacted these people and asked feedback as well. So we had, it was really like an iterative procedure. And then finally arriving at we would call a final definition, although I would say that it's never really final. Probably you can still develop, and maybe I have a discussion here today and I will think like, oh, that's true. Maybe we should revise the definition a little bit, but at least agreed upon a version of the definition that we could all
And then you uploaded it to the Decentralized Construct Taxonomy website?
That still has to happen, but that is the idea.
That's the final step. Okay. And then if you kind of revise the definition, then you would update it, right? And then you can kind of track the process.
So you can track the different versions of your definition. So that would be version 1 then, if we upload it now. And so we have submitted a preprint to peer community and so of the process. So really describing our process and so on. So maybe we will still get feedback, and then that could be the second version maybe of our definitions.
So Annick, when thinking about, because it seems what's crucial kind of within this method or this way of thinking is the defining necessary and sufficient conditions for something to be an instance of, for example, coping planning. But it seems like, and maybe there are also parallels to, well, later episodes when we will be talking about causal inference and thinking about what needs to be included in your causal model. But here as well, so when thinking about necessary and sufficient conditions, how can we make sure that we really capture all of the different ones? So for coping planning, for example, you mentioned a few there. But for example, I didn't hear it go all the way down to kind of saying that, well, in order for it to be coping planning, it needs to be a mental process of the kind X, or it's sort of at maybe a slightly higher level of abstraction than that. So how do you sort of draw the line there?
That's a good question. I think for me, it would again boil down to maybe the purpose that you have for it. What will you be using it for? I think in our case, as I said, we mostly use it to inform digital health interventions. And so they are based on these determinants. And so I think in that sense, the definitions are probably somewhat informed by that. And I think, the definitions that we have now are useful in that sense, because they reflect the fact that, again, it's almost a kind of a technique. It's prospective, it's self-regulatory. And so you can see how you can maybe translate that in specific aspects of your intervention. I think in some cases, it could be useful to have a more general one and to go to that higher level of abstraction. So again, if we go to a more kind of an ontology and you go to those higher concepts, then maybe it makes sense to make them somewhat broader and have a higher level of abstraction. I think here we are already dealing with very concrete and more specific concepts. So then it makes sense to make them more specific as well. And again, the way in which we did it now, how we arrived at these attributes was really from looking at the definitions that were already out there, and kind of taking those elements out there. And there could be other approaches as well that may be useful. Maybe you could let it more come from researchers. If you have, for example, a concept that is not defined yet, a new concept that you create, you could maybe have discussions about that and come up with some attributes yourself. And then potentially you will have a higher level of abstraction. I think that's possible. It's not necessarily wrong, I think.
And what about, because you mentioned involving other researchers in the process and then asking for feedback more broadly, also soliciting the existing literature. But what about involving research participants or people with lived experience? Is this something that one could do in the process as well?
Yeah, definitely. I think, of course, the HAPA is also used in healthy volunteers, but especially for constructs that are relevant for patient populations, I would definitely advise to have a discussion with these patients as well, because they may have a very different view on it, which is also very valuable. So I think taking that perspective into account is really an asset. And even for HAPA, I mean, you could talk to people that are not necessarily researchers, but that are participating in interventions, for example, and ask them like, okay, what do you think about it? Then it's of course about thinking, and that will be true for patients as well, like what is the best way to do that? Because I think that can sometimes be challenging. I tried that for causal models, and I think that's somewhat related to really have from those discussions what you as a researcher want. That can sometimes be challenging. So it's thinking about the right prompts to have a valuable discussion on that and to have valuable information afterwards.
Right. I think we covered a lot of ground already. Is there anything else you want to say regarding this 4-step process? I guess anyone who's interested in applying this can just search in our show notes for the link to your paper and then just follow the procedure that you just so nicely described. I guess that would already be a call to action, right? I mean, since you published this, I think you would say that, we should do this more, right? Have clearer construct definitions and so on. But maybe to phrase it as a question, where do you think practitioners and researchers should start when they want to work with clearer construct definitions?
Yeah, I think definitely start mentioning definitions in your manuscripts. That's already a very first good step. Even if it's a vague definition, at least give one that we know what your definition is. And then in a second step, preferably don't use fake definitions, but make them somewhat more precise or clear. And of course, as I said, I mean, this was an elaborate procedure. We did it with 8 people, of course, for 4 concepts. But it took us a year in total. Of course, this was a side project, so it was not that we were only doing that. But so it did take some time. So I completely understand that we cannot do that every time. But it's about thinking what are the most important steps then. So look, having a quick search, okay, what are the definitions that have been used in the past? Or their definitions around? And then taking key parts from that. So that doesn't even mean that you have to really do a review, just have a quick search. And as I said, what I found very valuable is looking at related constructs and how you can differentiate, because that is also important when you then think about measurement instruments. You want to be sure that you're measuring your construct and not a related construct. So that's why I think that's important. Like, okay, what are the attributes that are important for your construct to be differentiated from other constructs? So that then with your measurement instrument, you can tag into those specific attributes and that you can be sure that you are actually measuring what you want to measure. So I think that's what I would see as the main take-home message.
Yeah, thank you. Great. Yeah. And also you already mentioned measurement. It's also a topic that we will cover more in the podcast. At least we plan to, right? So
Yes, and making sure that the next sort of step in the pipeline, that our measurements are capturing what we intend them to capture. But then I suppose there are also many researchers that argue that obtaining construct validity is very tricky, or maybe not possible in the ways that psychologists have defined this up until now. So this is also something that we will cover. Annick, I also realized that we forgot to mention that you are, of course, also one of the chairs or co-chairs of the special interest group in conceptualization, formalization, and measurement within the European Health Psychology Society. So, well, thank you for all your work within this, and I think our listeners will very much enjoy hearing about all of the exciting work that you've been doing here. So thank you so much for joining us on this podcast.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for having me and for the initiative. Yeah.
Of course, it was a pleasure. Yeah, let's wrap it up then, and let's see what the next episodes will bring. Bye-bye.